cartoon where it comes up, somebody talks about, they like their pronouns, or that their body's like a boy, but they realize they're actually a girl. We can talk about that and we can say, wait, what did they just say? What did they say was true? Did they say that their body revealed the truth or that their feelings revealed the truth? And so that's where we always just want to go back to this lie that feelings are truth, which is not true.
Yeah, I think you hit a great point there. And also this whole idea that, if you hurt my feelings, you must be wrong. I remember, not long ago teaching a Sunday school class, and I can't remember what the topic was. I'm sure we talked about some kind of sin, and a fourth grade boy, I've never had this before, came up to me and said, "I'm offended by what you said."
Oh.
And I'm like, well, if you're in sin, you probably won't be feeling that great, Let's talk about it, kind of thing. I'm not sure he knew what he was talking about. Just his feelings was hurt, but I've never had a child come and said, "I'm offended by what you said," in a way saying, you're wrong because what you said hurt my feelings. Are you seeing more of that? Is that what you're talking about?
Oh, yes. And that is such a good example. That's such a good example of exactly what I was saying, that young man, that fourth grader, had bought into the lie that his feelings were what determined right from wrong. And so since what you said made him feel something that was not a positive feeling, you therefore must have been wrong. I just think back to this example of when I was teaching third grade at a Christian school several years ago. I was teaching cursive handwriting to my students, and I was walking around the classroom one afternoon, correcting them as they were making this new cursive letter we were learning. And as I turned to one girl, I saw that she had been making the loop on her letter J backwards. And I said, "Oh, sweetie, that's the way we do the loop for the lowercase f. For the J, we go this way." And with these big, beautiful brown 8-year-old eyes, she looks up at me and she goes, "Don't you judge me." And I actually burst out laughing, because it was just so funny to me. But after I got control of my laughter, I said, okay, let's talk about this for a second. And I was able to ask her some questions to help her understand that even though she had felt hurt or offended or sad by what I had said to her, what I had said to her was what I needed to say. And I asked her some questions and I said, okay, let's talk about this for a second. I said, is there a right way to make the letter J? She said, yes. I said, okay, so that means, are there some wrong ways to make the letter J? Yeah. I said, okay, let's think about this. As your teacher, is it my job to make you feel good? Or is it my job to make sure that you learn things correctly? And she said, learn things correctly. And I said, you're right. And I want to make you feel good too, but sometimes I can't do both of those things. I said, so it is my job to judge your letter J. And so we see this a lot with kids, just of, believing this lie. And the reason that this lie is so easy to buy into is because we're all born believing it. Like, we don't have to be told my feelings represent what's true. We're just all naturally born believing that. Fortunately, for most of human history, society has believed the opposite and has corrected that. But I was just visiting my sister for Thanksgiving early, in 2024. And when I was there, my niece was really mad at me one morning simply because I decided to eat chili for breakfast. And chili is not a traditional US breakfast food. And she was really mad at me. And she kept giving me this evil eye. And she was just really mad. And the next morning I had chili again for breakfast. And I said, are you mad at me this morning? She goes, no, sometimes I just be mad, but I'm not mad now. And so what she was expressing was exactly what we're talking about. That even at 3, kids are programmed to believe if I feel it, it must be true. This is just the first time in Western civilization that we're living in a culture that promotes that 3-year-old lie. And so it gets more deeply, 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 deeply ingrained as we grow.
Yeah, you point out some of the mistakes we make as parents in saying things like follow your heart or things like that. But what are some mistakes that we Christian parents make when trying to protect the child's innocence from the world out there?
Yeah, well, the first thing I want to say to anyone who's listening who's a parent, I am not a parent. My experience with children is in the classroom. So I don't know the day in, day out difficulties of parenting, but I do know that it's a huge responsibility and it's very difficult. So I just want to thank you for listening to this podcast. And my goal is not to tell you all the things that you're doing wrong, but just to help point out just some wisdom in the daily grind. But I think as I've worked with so many Christian parents, I have noticed Christian parents kind of take one of two extremes when it comes to like protecting their children's innocence, both of which I think are very, very unwise. And the first extreme that I have seen is some parents just kind of throw it out the window. They're just like, the world's out there. My kids got to get used to it. You know what? Here we go, head first, diving into that. And I think that that's very unwise because in that situation, the parent typically hasn't done any preparation to help their kid be prepared for what they are going to encounter. And so what this could look like is sending a child to a public school without doing any worldview formation at home. Now, I'm not here saying that a Christian parent can never send their child to a public school, but I'm saying sending them to a public school without actively trying to formulate their worldview at home and preparing them for what they're going to face day in and day out in that public school classroom, that is very, very unwise. And it can also look like just putting a child in front of a tablet or giving them, like their own phone without any restrictions, without the parent's knowledge of the different apps or shows that they're interacting with, and without the parent's guidance of saying, okay, let's pause the show, or let's pause this video game that you're playing. Let's talk about what you just saw. Because if we just kind of like throw our kids into the deep end like that, that's kind of like, I like to give the example, false ideas are kind of like viruses. It's kind of almost like throwing your kids in the tuberculosis ward at a hospital. We would never do that. We never go, yeah, let's go spend a week in the tuberculosis ward, to get you used to germs. No, that's very unwise. However, conversely, on the opposite end of the spectrum, what I see parents do is I see parents work so hard to try to prevent kids from even having any knowledge of worldly ideas that they leave them without any preparation for what they are going to be facing. I mean, you can't even just drive down the road without seeing signs and billboards, or be in stores and hear songs, or, play on a playground and hear kids talk about, other ideas that are out there. And so, using that virus analogy again, this type of extreme isolation, what it does is it doesn't give kids any opportunity to build up an intellectual and spiritual immune system. It just like keeps feeding them what's good, but it doesn't prepare them for what they're going to face in the world around them. I think back to, when we were quarantined so long during COVID. I'm single and I live alone. And so I was by myself for a very long time. And because I wasn't exposed to any other humans during that period, I was very, very healthy during that period of isolation. Like I went 3.5 years without so much as a sore throat. I was like, wow, this is amazing. Things are going well. Well, then the world opened back up and I went back to normal life. And I was so sick for like 6 months, wow. Just with like normal colds and flus and viruses, because my immune system had been so weakened. And so this is similar. If we work so hard to isolate our children, then one day when they are exposed to the ideas of the world, they don't have any immune system from which to combat them. So those are two extremes I would really highly encourage parents to avoid, either the, just throwing them in head first without any preparation, and then keeping them so hidden that they also don't have any preparation.
Yes, you talked about how to teach worldview at home. I think we had a previous show on this, and you mentioned a little bit about it when you're watching cartoons or reading a book, to pause and say, hey, let's take a look at what this said. What are some real briefly practical tips? And this is what your ministry really is all about. How do you ingrain the Christian worldview in your children at a very young age?
Yeah, so I think that involves two key things when we're talking about the Christian worldview. And the first thing is we have to make sure that our kids understand Scripture. Because a lot of times as Christians, we can talk a lot about Christian things and we can talk a lot about Scripture, but we might never have actually immersed ourselves in it. I call myself a Christian. That Christian is someone who follows Jesus. You learn about who Jesus is and what he's done in the Bible. And so I was probably about 22 years old when I realized, or actually, no, I was about 19 years old when I realized that I had never read through the entire Bible from cover to cover. And I thought, how can I call myself a Christian, if I've never read through this entire book, this entire book or collection of books. And so that year I challenged myself, and in 2 years I read through the Bible. And then I had someone after that say, Elizabeth, in order to consider yourself an expert in anything, you really have to go through it at least 7 times. So you really can't consider yourself an expert in scripture unless you've read through it 7 times. And I thought, oh my goodness gracious, are you kidding me? But they were right. I don't consider myself a biblical expert, but the more you read through scripture, the more you come to know what the worldview is that the Bible presents. And it's similar with our kids. Our kids, they need to be immersed in scripture. Now, this doesn't mean, some people falsely think that you read scripture with your kids and you read scripture over it, and it means they're going to be Christians. And it means that, everything that you say, they're going to know. No. It just means that our kids will at least know what is in scripture. And so this involves, what is the whole story of scripture? What are the different genres of scripture? How is the New Testament a continuation of the Old Testament? All of those things. So that's something that's really important for us to make sure that we're doing with our children. The second thing that I think is important to do is to really help our kids understand how the Bible speaks to specific topics. So not only that they understand the entirety of scripture, but when we think about a subject like humanity, what does the Bible teach about what it means to be human? And so we have to start off with that foundation and then diving into scripture and looking, right off from Genesis 1, in verse 27, where it talks about God creating man in his image. Then in Genesis 3, talking about the fall of mankind, and then in the Psalms, talking about us being fearfully and wonderfully made. And then, going through Romans and talking about how we've all sinned, in Adam, and then about reconciliation through Jesus, so that our kids understand that scripture teaches we're created in the image of God. We're both physical and spiritual. We're body and soul. We're fallen, but that doesn't take away the fact that we have been wonderfully created by God. We're all sinners, but we can be redeemed in Jesus. But then once they understand that from the biblical perspective, then looking at what do other worldviews teach about humans? And looking at other worldviews, if we're coming from a materialist or a naturalist or just a strictly atheistic worldview, the belief that humans are just physical, that there is no metaphysical or spiritual component to us. Looking at how according to that worldview do we get here? Well, according to that worldview, we got here accidentally as the products of blind, unguided evolution. Okay, if we believe that we're created in God's image, how should that impact us and how we treat others? And looking at the implications of that worldview. If I believe that I got here accidentally, you got here accidentally, what does that mean about why we're here? Well, there is no purpose. What does that mean? What does that lead us to for how we treat one another? Mm-hmm. Well, we're really fortunate that we live in a society that thinks that we should treat one another nicely, but what happens if one day we live in a society where there isn't that belief? Then there is no reason for us to treat one another with kindness and respect. So just helping our kids understand first what the biblical perspective is, but then also understanding what are other perspectives, whether it's a secular perspective or whether you're looking at another religion, such as Buddhism or Islam, according to these other worldviews, what does it mean to be human? And then we can do this with so many different topics, like what does the Bible say about right and wrong and how we figure out what right and wrong are? What do other worldviews teach about this? We can look at other questions like, who is God? Or what is most important? What should I worship? Big questions like that. So I think those are two really important components in developing our children's worldview. First, immersing them in scripture, then helping them understand how scripture answers big questions and how those answers differ from other worldviews.
Now, how early do you think children can start understanding these concepts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like that one. When we're talking about a biblical worldview, really, we can start that training as young as 3 or 4 years old. At Foundation Worldview, we have resources to help parents develop a biblical worldview in their children. And if we just understand how God has designed the human child to develop, we can help really instill these truths by taking our kids to scripture, but also getting them involved. Like, for example, one of the concepts that we teach